Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us again for the second day. I know we got off to a very deep and meaningful start. I think quite a few of us went to bed quite late, so thank you all for being here for a 9 o'clock start. I do appreciate it. Just say we've got just to give you a bit of outline of today, we're starting with Michael Fuller's keynote. We've then got a coffee break, and then we have got our new voices sessions, which we really encourage you to attend. They're a bit of not quite a 3-minute thesis, we've given them 10 minutes, but a very short introduction to some nice diverse topics, which hopefully you'll all enjoy, and they'll be in both here and the Rendell Harris room, which is the room directly opposite you as you go out of this door. And then after that, we're going straight into the Peacock Prize presentation as well. So I think a really exciting morning before we get to lunch. So hopefully everyone's happy. They know where things are now. They know that tea and coffee is in the dining room on tap. And basically same fire exits as yesterday. So if the fire alarm sounds, it isn't expected, please leave by the nearest fire exit, which is behind you. And then we're assembling on the lawn that way. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Nathan, who is chairing this session for us.
All right, well, I'll keep this very, very short. So we've got our second keynote today, which is it's going to be a really good one. We've got a few over there, today and tomorrow as well. So looking forward to what Michael Fuller has for us today. Michael Fuller's going to talk for about an hour. And Finn's kind of mentioned the kind of stuff that's going to take place later on, and we got Q&A after Michael Fuller's talk. So if you do have questions, prepare those, and I can give those to Michael Fuller. Yeah, I think with that, I can introduce you and can let you kind of go. So also I should say that I was just speaking to Michael Fuller now and just kind of made the connection that he actually taught, did one of the modules at least for my master's degree in philosophy, science and religion at Edinburgh. So I kind of made that connection, which is quite nice. So it's a bit of an honor to kind of be able to chair for his session. So with that being said, let's give a little introduction to Michael Fuller. The Reverend Canon Dr. Michael Fuller teaches in the field of science and religion at New College, University of Edinburgh. Having initially pursued research in the field of organic chemistry at the University of Oxford, he studied theology at the University of Cambridge and was ordained in the Church of England. For more than a decade, he supervised the training of candidates for ministry in the Scottish Episcopal Church. He is former chair of the UK Science and Religion Forum, so this organisation, and is the current vice president for publications of the European Society for the Study of Science and Theology. In addition to numerous books, he's published over 30 academic articles and book chapters, and he's currently pursuing research on how understandings of big data might feed into the dialogue of science and theology, which is along the lines of his topic today. So his talk is called Big Data, Risks and Theological Responses. So we look forward to your talk today. And over to you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Nathan. Thank you. It's very good to be with you at this fascinating and very timely conference. I've greatly enjoyed the talks so far. What I have to say this morning, I hope, will dovetail somewhat with some of the topics that Beth raised for us yesterday. I hope this talk won't be too much of a Jeremiad by comparison. Now, big data is a term that's been variously understood, but it's widely used to describe the vast data sets that are generated in various ways through the widespread use of computing in the modern world. You contribute to such data sets every time you engage with, say, the National Health Service, or your bank or insurer, every time you use online services, every time you use social media, every time you simply surf the internet because you're feeling a bit bored. Now, you may not think there's anything very risky in doing these things and using these services, After what I have to say this morning, you may still not think it's very risky, because risk is, of course, something to which different people respond in different ways. But I hope at least to convince you that there are aspects of the phenomenon of big data that present very significant issues, and it's urgent that we consider those issues very carefully. So, what I want to do this morning is to say a little bit more about what we mean by big data and by data science. I'll then look at specific issues that arise when we consider first the gathering and the monetization of data, then the processing of data, and also the presentation and interpretation of data. And I'll also say a little about the important ways that I think that theologians and religious communities like churches can be in a position to address at least some of these issues. So let's start by thinking about what is big data. Consider, for example, the data set that's generated by the search terms that people put into Google over a 24-hour period. Which obviously is all information that's all retained by Google. Now, that information is gathered at great speed, in real time. It's vast, there's a huge amount of it. It's extraordinarily diverse. People will be interrogating Google on all kinds of different topics. And it contains a great deal of what might turn out to be very valuable information. So this has been characterized as the 4 V's. Velocity, these data sets are gathered very quickly. Volume, they're huge. Variety, they're very heterogeneous. And value, they can be turned into money. And note particularly that last factor. That, of course, is what's driving the development of data analysis, the fact that money can be made out of this. But the distinctiveness of big data goes well beyond straightforward issues of quantity of material. It's been pointed out that with the accumulation of so much data, something new and special is taking place. Not only is the world awash with more information than ever before, but that information is growing faster. The change of scale has led to a change of state. The quantitative change has led to a qualitative one. Extremely large data sets are not simply quantitatively different to smaller ones. Their sheer scale, it's maintained, brings about a step change, making them qualitatively distinct too. And this means that new tools, new models are required for their handling and analysis. And this, in turn, it's been argued, means that such analysis amounts to a new kind of practice, which is appropriate to the handling of very large data sets. And this has led to the coining of the terms data science and data scientist to describe the new techniques that are required and the practitioners of those techniques. The capabilities required of data scientists are considerable. It's been suggested that they must combine the skills of the statistician, software programmer, infographics designer, and storyteller. And this, I think, is significant. Data science is not just about gathering data and fitting them into preordained schema. It goes way beyond the tasks carried out traditionally by a statistician. It's about presenting that information and about telling stories. And of course, the same data can be used to tell many different stories. And that in turn brings a whole new set of questions. As Boyd and Crawford have noted, the age of big data has only just begun, but it's important that we start questioning the assumptions, values, and biases of this new wave of research. And this, I think, is an urgent task, As such, assumptions, values, and biases may be unhelpful or erroneous. They may get baked into procedures very early on when that unhelpfulness and erroneousness is not realized, and they may have the potential to cause considerable harm, as we shall see. So that's just a little bit about what we understand by that term big data. Let's go on to look at the way in which big data is gathered. As I've indicated, every time we engage with services that make use of our computers, we surrender data to those who run those services, whether we're consciously aware of that or not. And I'm sure we're all well aware of one consequence of that, which is that we're bombarded with adverts every time we use the internet. And those adverts are targeted through the collection and sifting of the sites we've visited in the past. So what, you might think? Such ads may occasionally be useful. They're easy enough to ignore if they're not. A website like Amazon, you may be interested to know, constantly scans your search history in order to recommend things you might want to buy. It's a commercially very successful way to proceed. Something like 1/3 of all Amazon's sales are generated by this means, the suggestions they make to their customers. And on one or two occasions, I've been made aware myself of a book or a CD that I hadn't known about, and I've been prompted to buy it. So it might be argued that this kind of sifting of information serves both me and Amazon very well. And when their suggestions aren't helpful, why the Amazon algorithm thought that I might have a liking for Frank Zappa, I have absolutely no idea. When that happens, one can just laugh and move on. But the way in which our data is harvested raises a couple of very important questions, I think. Consent and the ownership of data. Let's look first at consent. When you use internet services, you'll be asked at some points to tick a box indicating your consent to the terms and conditions that apply to using that service. In practice, though, it's been observed that this is a process that's geared rather more towards limiting the liabilities of those harvesting the data than it is to genuinely informing you as data subjects. One commentator has observed, the parties gathering the data typically attempt to minimize the ability of the person about whom the data is being gathered to comprehend the scope of the data and its usage through a mixture of sharp design and obscure legal jargon. Not only this, it's been noted that little bits of innocuous data can say a lot in combination. It's virtually impossible for a person to make meaningful judgments about the costs and benefits of revealing certain data. And I'll say more about that in a moment. This leads to situations in which people consent to the collection, use, and disclosure of their personal data when it's actually not in their self-interests to do so. There's then the issue of ownership. Are data property? And if so, who owns that property? Should it be the person to whom the data relates, the data subject, or the organisation which has invested time and resources into gathering it? Should something like copyright protection apply to data to prohibit its use or reproduction by parties who infringe ownership? And such copyright would of course also maximise the opportunity for those who own data to extract profit from it. Or should data be part of an information commons, which might be understood as a body of knowledge and information that's available to anyone to use without the need to ask for or receive permission from another, providing any conditions placed on its use are respected? Let me give an example to illustrate some of this. Say I give my GP a blood sample to check my cholesterol levels. Analysis of that sample may yield an awful lot of other information about me as well. Who owns that information? Is it me? Is it the NHS? Is it any other party with whom the NHS may have contractual arrangements for analysing samples given to it? Should the data from my sample be treated as a commercially sensitive asset, with restrictions placed on who may access it, or should it be made freely available to assist those engaged with medical research through this information commons kind of idea? Incidentally, those of you who live in England, did you know that NHS England assumes your consent for the use of your, quote, confidential patient information being used for research and planning, unquote, unless you opt out of that arrangement? You have to opt out, otherwise it's assumed your information can be shared in this way. The situation, I'm glad to say, is different in Scotland, where I am. Now, data of all kinds, no matter how innocuous it may seem, can be monetized. Data brokerage is big business, and this leads us to the issue of the commercialization and regulation of the commercial use of personal data. It's been noted that data brokers are generally largely unregulated and are not required by law to provide individuals access to the data held by them, nor are they obliged to correct errors relating to those individuals. A report by the Canadian Internet Policy and Public Interest Clinic, CIPPIC, on the Canadian data broker industry makes this sobering judgment. The increasing accumulation of personal data and consolidation of databases leaves individuals vulnerable to abuses by those with access to the data. Once released into the marketplace, personal data cannot be retrieved. Potential uses of this data are limited only by law and ethics. The financially motivated phenomenon of data brokerage has developed very swiftly in response to market demands. It has yet to be properly held to account by either ethicists or legislators, and it would appear to be that the longer this situation continues, the more this business is likely to mushroom, and the harder it is likely to become to impose ethical or legal restrictions upon it. And I would suggest this is an area where the need for concerted action is becoming daily more acute. Okay, so now someone has your data, whether or not you are aware of that fact, and whether or not they have gathered it from themselves or procured it from another source. A fresh rash of issues arises when we consider the storage and processing of your data, relating to the security of how the data is held, your personal privacy, and the way in which data is manipulated through algorithmic processes. What, first of all, about security? Now, I wonder how many of those in this room have, on the one hand, received scam emails inviting you to click on a link which will enable you to be the recipient of a large and often curiously specific sum of money. Who's had such? Right, quite a few of us have had emails of that kind, right. And on the other hand, how many have been contacted by their banks for genuine reasons because there's been some unexplained activity relating to your bank account? Right, okay, again, quite a lot of us. Unscrupulous individuals and organisations see in our digitised world a great opportunity to defraud other people by luring them to disclose information or by directly hacking into their accounts. The widespread use of encryption when we're making payments online is, of course, simply a spur to hackers to find ways of getting around such encryption. Genuine financial operators are therefore playing a constant game of catch-up with ever more sophisticated hackers looking for ways of defrauding them and their clients. So that's a major security issue. There's then the possibility that data may simply degrade through long storage and or repeated transfer from one location to another. Those handling data are obliged to use whatever technologies they can to prevent the exposure of data to degradation or cyber attack. But an important issue remains, which is to what extent are those whose personal data might be compromised by such degradation or security breaches made aware of the risks to which they're exposing themselves when they consent to the gathering of their data. There's another very important issue with regards to privacy. Even if your data is kept so securely that it's impossible, or virtually impossible, for it to degrade or be hacked. Sensitive data relating to your health records, say, or to surveys that you've completed, might well be anonymized. And you may think that's an effective way of keeping you safe. Think again. Preserving that anonymity turns out to be deeply problematic. In practice, when data has been anonymized, it can be very straightforward to break that anonymity by triangulating between different data sets. As an illustration of this, in the American context, it's been pointed out that knowing an individual's zip code localizes that person to 1 in 30,000, the average population of a zip code. Linking a zip code with a birth date reduces the pool to approximately 1 in 80, while further connecting gender and year of birth are sufficient, on average, to uniquely specify an individual. So, if different anonymized databases, one of which contains a person's zip code, another that person's birthday, another their gender, and a fourth their year of birth, if those 4 data sets are linked, it's highly likely that the person can be uniquely identified. It's hard to resist the conclusion that privacy and big data are simply incompatible. And not only this, the possibility exists of forming detailed pictures of an individual around that person's digital footprint. Not only their purchases of goods and services, but also their communications via phone and email, and indeed their physical movements if they carry a device which is GPS enabled. This is what's been termed data valence. Now, there may be justification for such activity if this is in terms of monitoring the activity of individuals who may be thought to be terrorist or security risks. But such data valence may also be seen as a direct infringement of privacy, to which the use of big data gives rise. Here's a personal and really rather trivial anecdote that again illustrates some of this. Shortly before the onset of the COVID pandemic, I began to receive advertisements, when I was logged online, I began to receive advertisements for hotels in the town of Oban, in Argyll. Now, I often receive ads of this kind based on bookings that I've made to travel to various places. Indeed, I once had British Airways kindly front-load its bookings page with flights from Berlin after I'd used a completely different website to book a hotel in Berlin. But on this occasion, I had made no travel arrangements to go to Oban, nor had I been looking at any Oban-related material on the internet. But my wife had, because she planned to visit there with one of our children. Now, my wife has a different surname to me. We have separate online accounts, which we use for our internet purchases. My guess is that I was targeted with ads which her online activity generated because we live at the same postal address. Doubtless, the sharing of your data between commercial websites and the linking of your data with someone else's is carefully explained in the small print of the terms and conditions which I and my wife had given our consent to when we signed up to use these services. But this rather trivial incident, I hope, surfaces and serves to exemplify two important aspects of the big data phenomenon. First, the information you put into your computer may very easily be cross-linked with information elsewhere. And second, there's a huge market in what's known as data brokerage, the harvesting and selling on of our data. There's very little in your digital footprint that can't be used by someone to make a profit. Right, so now we have gathered this data, we're aware of some of the issues around in the processing of that data. What about presenting and interpreting the data? These two activities are also full of pitfalls, and they may consciously or unconsciously be used to skew decision-making and reinforce bias in ways that I think should be of deep concern to us all. To illustrate what I mean when I talk about the presentation of data, consider this entirely made-up scenario. Okay? Suppose you're trying to explain to someone that their diet is unhealthy, and you showed them this diagram. Now, I'm no dietitian. As I say, this is an entirely made-up example. I'm no dietitian, but I think this diagram shows very clearly that the person concerned is eating rather too much in the way of fat. So I don't know if you can read this. The blue is fibre, the sort of buff colour is carbs, grey is fats, and the sort of yellowy green is proteins. Okay? The basic constituents of a diet. Now this diagram, I think, shows a person that they're eating rather too much in the way of fats in their diet. And it might well be that they can take that on board and change their behaviour as a consequence. But I suspect that they would be much more inclined to make such behavioural changes if you showed them that diagram. Now that's exactly the same information as in the first, but what you're interested in, the fats, is now moved from bottom left to top right and coloured red. Okay? And you look, your priority is always for the top right, isn't it, in diagrams of this sort? And red has a long-standing association with danger. Yeah? So that second, they contain exactly the same information, but the second one is actually communicating much more, I suggest, than the first. Okay? Now, suppose that you are presenting complex data to people who don't really understand it. And that's a position which data scientists may very well be in when they're called on to make a presentation to the board of a company, say. The way in which these presentations are made can encourage your audience to form a particular view of the data being presented. Maybe you want your bosses on the board, you know that they want the data to yield a particular result, about the result of a drugs trial, for example, even if the data by themselves are perhaps ambiguous. The presentation of data, the way these figures are presented, can drive home a particular message, and that message may result in people making decisions that have massive consequences for people's lives. And this is what I meant by that comment to which I referred earlier, that one of the skills required of data scientists is that they be storytellers, graphic designers and storytellers. Now, this, as I say, trivial and made-up example is a fairly straightforward one, fairly simple one. In fact, big data sets can be vastly more ambiguous and require much more care in the ways in which they're interpreted. It's been well observed that when the amount of data is sufficiently large, you can find almost anything you seek lurking somewhere within. So what is derived from a data set depends on the ways in which it's interrogated. That's to say, the automated mathematical processes, the algorithms that are used to analyze it. Now, it might be thought that data just is. It occupies some kind of neutral space. It acquires meaning and value only through its interpretation. Numbers, I don't know if you know, it's a commonplace, isn't it, that numbers actually carry more authority than words. They're thought of as being less ambiguous somehow. But as one commentator has observed, data are framed technically, economically, ethically, temporally, spatially, and philosophically. Data do not exist independently of the ideas, instruments, practices, contexts, and knowledges used to generate, process, and analyze them. Data are never simply just data. How data are conceived and used varies between those who capture, analyze, and draw conclusions from them. I suggest there are two aspects to this. First, particular tools used to analyze data may themselves have preconceptions embedded within them. The algorithms used to process the data are imbued with particular values and contextualized within a particular scientific approach. And second, individual researchers may be affected by their own conscious or unconscious biases. Researchers must be able to account for the biases in their interpretation of the data. To do so, it requires recognizing that one's identity and perspective informs one's analysis. Now, alas, it would appear that the notes of caution being sounded here are largely drowned out by the big brass bands of commercial interests, to the extent that a major consequence of the use of big data has been to entrench unfairness and social injustice. In the United States in particular, big data has found widespread use in such fields as policing, assessing people's suitability for loans or for jobs, and targeted advertising aimed at everything from selling products to enrolling people on university courses. Cathy O'Neill has pointed out, in a very thought-provoking analysis bearing the wonderful title Weapons of Math Destruction, she's pointed out that a practical consequence of the use of big data is that it frequently has the net effect of reinforcing social inequalities. For example, if a person's poor credit record and home address in a poor neighbourhood are judged to make them unsuitable candidates for a job which they're seeking, or are used as justification for charging them higher insurance premiums, this has the net effect of denying them opportunities and reinforcing their existing poverty. It's long been recognised that access, or lack of it, to the benefits brought by computers has the potential to deepen social inequality. The application of big data analysis to categorising and sorting people has the capacity to take that unfairness to entirely new levels. O'Neill puts it like this: the poor are expected to remain poor forever and are treated accordingly, denied opportunities, jailed more often, and gouged for services and loans. It's inexorable, often hidden and beyond appeal, and unfair. Recall what we've already noted, incidentally, about the lack of accountability regarding big data. Information held on you might be erroneous, but you can't appeal it, and once it's out there, it's permanent. The problem of algorithms used to analyse data having particular biases built into them is illustrated by the particularly egregious example of a risk assessment tool used within the American legal system to predict whether or not defendants would reoffend. This tool was noted to give high-risk scores to black defendants who did not go on to reoffend, and low-risk scores to white defendants who did reoffend. Cursed by the algorithm, perhaps. Yeah? And it's been noted that there's a particular problem when algorithms display biases of this kind, because early decisions, which may seem perfectly reasonable at the time, can bake in difficulties further down the line, and only rarely are prior problem formulation decisions revisited with a critical eye. So an early decision, which may appear quite innocuous at the time it's made, may then generate significant knock-on effects, which is very unfair, but the earlier decision's never actually revisited to check. As we've noted, in our empirically minded world, numbers carry a great deal more authority in our discourse than words do. So if an algorithm churns out a percentage that deems someone to be a high risk for insurance, say, that risk is likely to be accepted without much discussion, even though the processes by which that percentage was arrived at may very well embody biases and prejudices. It's still widely thought that numbers speak for themselves, without proper attention being paid to how those numbers were arrived at. And when we address that question, how those numbers are arrived at, they may well turn out to be speaking not for themselves, but for particular vested interests. You see what I mean about a Jeremiad? So, how can we respond to all this? Well, a variety of practical responses might be made to the issues identified here. Security issues can be addressed through technological developments and innovation. It might be possible to address some concerns through legal and regulatory means, though doing this is complex for at least two reasons. First, such regulation needs to draw on the insights of specialists in a number of different disciplines, not just data scientists, but also legal experts, ethicists, political and social scientists, and others. And getting such groups of people together is a non-trivial task. And second, given that we are, of course, talking here about a worldwide web, the transmission of data across national boundaries is straightforward. So any proposed regulation would need to command international approval. Here, of course, vested interests may well prevail in some countries but not in others, leading to great difficulties in enforcing such regulation across national boundaries. Those of you who had dealings a few years back with making sure organisations were compliant with the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, when that was brought in, you may have thought that ensuring compliance to that was a bit of a pain. I strongly suspect that it's infinitely preferable to what will ensue if the UK now pulls out of GDPR. And of course there are some issues that can be addressed through ethical considerations. Here I made a distinction a few years back between what I termed jus in scientia, ethical practice in the collection and analysis of data, and jus ad seculum, the proper presentation of risk to data subjects and the proper presentation of conclusions drawn by experts from their analyses to the wider world. And I'm sure from what I've said so far you can see that different issues obtain in these two scenarios. The tools used by data scientists to date have not tended to prioritise ethical considerations. O'Neill, though, has urged that we have to explicitly embed better values into our algorithms, creating big data models that follow our ethical lead. Sometimes that will mean putting fairness ahead of profit. And frankly, there's very little obligation on anybody to do that at the moment, to put fairness ahead of profit. Much work with big data is, of course, profit-driven, so ethical frameworks are required that can override financial considerations. How these could be generated, I think, is a non-trivial issue. We might perhaps look to professional bodies, such as the Association of Internet Researchers, which has in fact produced ethical guidelines for its members, though issues remain about the widespread adoption and enforcement of such guidelines. They're not obligatory and there's no way of enforcing them. It's been suggested that a kind of Hippocratic oath might be developed for data scientists, analogous to the one used by the medical profession, but again, how that oath might be administered and enforced is clearly going to be problematic. Now, these responses are, I think, all very important. But do religious communities in general, and the Christian churches in particular, have anything to offer in addressing the risks and concerns posed by big data to the citizens of today? I think they do. So I want to look now at some theological responses to all this, indicating both theoretical and practical ways in which they can contribute to the debates around big data. Let's deal with theoretical issues first. It's important not to lose sight of the fact that data constitute just one part of a much bigger picture. Individuals focused on particular data analytical tasks may lose sight of the human stories that lie behind the data, and of their work as data scientists as being anything other than the application of mechanical algorithmic processes directed towards abstract ends. Effectively, human beings are reduced to numbers, patterns, and trends. It's even been suggested that social determinism underpins data analysis, so that the person you are is largely determined by your social context. So if I, i.e. the data scientist, if I can see some of your behaviours, I can infer the rest just by comparing you to the people in your crowd. Now, to counter that kind of approach, I think insights from theological anthropology can offer a more helpful way of thinking about human beings. In contrast to this kind of social determinism, a theologically informed position might insist that every person is unique, complex, and formed by their relationships with others and with God. Moreover, a theological analysis might affirm, people are intrinsically valuable. They don't have value conferred upon them through the measurable parameters that can contribute to a big data set, and which can thereby be used to monetize them. Their value doesn't come from that kind of pecuniary value. So in short, people are more than the data they generate. And I think theological insights like these have a crucially important part to play alongside purely ethical critiques of big data. They can serve the purpose of constantly reminding data scientists and data subjects alike of the big picture within which all our endeavours are set. They can insist that the goal of data analysis should be the promotion of human flourishing. They can also give voice to the imperative that big data be used justly, so that the gains that can be made through its use are shared as widely as possible and benefit as many people as possible. And there's a further, very particular skill which I think the theological community can offer to the practice of data science. As we noted, when the amount of data is sufficiently large, you can find almost anything you seek lurking somewhere within. Data scientists are therefore engaged in a complex interpretative exercise which involves recognition of the history and context of the data they're analysing, and the biases contained both in it and in the analytical techniques that are being used to explore it, as well as their own inbuilt biases, conscious and unconscious, and the complexities of the probably commercial context in which their work is being carried out. It's long been recognised, in fact, that the interpretation of statistics raises hermeneutical questions. Hans-Georg Gadamer observed, "What is established by statistics seems to be the language of facts, but which questions these facts answer, and which facts would begin to speak if other questions were asked, these are hermeneutical questions." Now, complex interpretive exercises are familiar, of course, to those theologians, especially those who deal with the interpretations of texts, and they developed a suite of hermeneutical skills to assist them in engaging with such interpretation. So I would suggest that a dialogue between data scientists and theologians around hermeneutical practices could be an important way in which skills developed in the service of a religious tradition might also valuably inform practices within this developing new science. It's often been observed that the dialogue between theology and the sciences has been a rather one-way affair, with theology taking on board insights from the sciences rather more often than vice versa. But here, perhaps, there's the clear possibility, at least, of theology holding out tools that could be of great value to data scientists. So these are, if you like, theoretical ways in which theologians might respond to the challenges of big data. But there is also a practical role in which religious communities like churches can play a significant part in terms of raising awareness and encouraging discussion of all these matters. Christianity, in common with other faith traditions, places a high value on notions of accountability, fairness, social justice. Where values like these are being flouted, for example through keeping people ignorant of the consequences of giving up their data, or through the use of big data analysis to reinforce social inequalities, or through the gathering, storage and trade of personal data without effective consent by unaccountable commercial organisations, then the churches, I think, should speak out against such practices and lobby for their restriction. And such church involvement need not be solely concerned with restrictions, of course. There are huge benefits which the applications of big data may bring to society, and the churches might therefore also lobby to ensure that such benefits are distributed equably among all citizens. Such practical actions as these, I think, can in turn be manifested by churches in both top-down and bottom-up ways. Top-down approaches may come from the organisational leadership of religious organisations like churches, which, for example, might make statements or issue reports for public consumption. As an example of this, the Church of Scotland, it has a Society, Religion and Technology project which acts as a resource for disseminating information about important issues in science and technology. And in May 2021, it produced a report titled Artificial Intelligence, Opportunity and Challenge for the Church, in which it noted several of the points I've made here. It states, for example, this report states that legal protection is required for individuals against harm and discrimination in a situation where a few know everything about us while we know little about them. It also says human biases and prejudices around gender, race, religion, lifestyle and postcode can become embedded and hidden in population data. The results can be profoundly discriminatory and a risk to human rights. This report, which you can turn up on the Church of Scotland website if you're interested, it's linked to a series of videos and discussion aids designed to stimulate church members to consider issues around artificial intelligence, around the use of data, around robotics, all these reports and videos are available online, as I say, through the Church of Scotland website. So this kind of top-down initiative is, I think, greatly to be welcomed. But local congregations have further roles to play in a more bottom-up kind of way. They are communities which allow issues to be discussed and owned by a broader public than that which is likely to engage with these issues when they're presented in purely ethical terms. They can also constitute a safe space which enable an engagement with these important issues through both head and heart. Ethical matters can elicit visceral as well as intellectual responses. And I think local churches can be places where both can be engaged effectively. In more purely academic fora, it is likely, I think, that these sorts of visceral responses will be downplayed or poo-pooed because everything there revolves around head-based responses. A church or churches can allow for both to be engaged. So churches and other religious groupings can therefore become places in which people's enthusiasms, hopes and fears regarding big data can be discussed, and openness with regard to big data can be encouraged. As awareness of the questions surrounding big data increases, the need for such spaces will, I think, inevitably become more and more acute. So, in conclusion, let me briefly summarise first what I've said so far. Big data brings with it a number of concerns which focus, inter alia, on how data are gathered, how they're traded, processed, presented and interpreted. The speed with which this field is developing is also an issue. It means that anyone wishing to address these concerns is constantly playing catch-up as new ideas and new techniques are developed and implemented. Any responses to the concerns I've raised here will need to bring together insights from a variety of parties, data scientists, legislators, ethicists and others, and will need to result in solutions that can be enforced across national boundaries. And I've suggested that theologians and religious communities also have a number of things which can be brought to the table, including theological critiques of the ways in which data science thinks about human beings, hermeneutical expertise in the analysis of big data, and the provision of safe spaces for citizens to engage with questioning around the social and ethical issues that big data raises. I'll finish with another brief reflection. I mentioned earlier that different people have different attitudes to the notion of risk. Many people will doubtless feel that the enormous benefits that accrue from our surrendering our data in a variety of different contexts, in our use of commercial internet sites, in the comments we make on social media, these are well worth any inconveniences that might follow from them. But I think there are three things of which we should be constantly aware. The first is that your data is part of a massive phenomenon that affects not just you, but millions of others too. You may live in a well-heeled postcode, so your home and car insurance don't feel excessive. Getting a bank loan to install that much-needed third bathroom might be reasonably straightforward. But you're part of a system that means other people without your privileges pay more and have opportunities denied to them. We're all complicit here in something which is already entrenching social injustice and which has the potential to get far worse in doing so. The second is that there's a real risk that we're trading short-term convenience for long-term problems. Another trivial example to illustrate what I mean by this: it may be really handy to get those loyalty points when you do a shop in a supermarket. But that means that all your purchases there have been logged, and it's perfectly possible for someone to analyse them and red flag your excessive purchasing of, say, sweets, crisps, and alcohol. This in turn might cost you dear if that data is linked to any life insurance or health protection scheme that requires you to be a safe bet in terms of your life expectancy. There's nothing personal in all these references to dietary concerns, by the way. The digital world is massively interconnected, and your footprint in it has the potential to tell a lot of people a great deal about you, information which, should it be incorrect, you're in no position to put right in the unlikely event you are ever actually realising that it's incorrect. Remember that when such things happen, they're likely to be hidden from view and irremediable for as long as data speaks for itself with a voice that's louder than that of the individual citizen. More positively, though, the third thing I want us to remember is that we are by no means without resources for addressing these issues, as I hope I've shown, and in particular, we have access to theological resources, theological thinking, and practical work by religious communities that have the potential to do a great deal, I think, in ameliorating these risks. Finally, if you have any interest in following up some of the topics I've explored this morning, you might want to, the easiest way you can follow up some of this is by turning up my article, Big Data, Ethics and Religion, New Questions from a New Science, which you can download from the open access journal Religions. So if you just Google Religions Journal, you'll turn up their homepage, put my name in the search box on that homepage, and you can turn up this article. It's open access. Thank you very much indeed for your attention. I hope all this hasn't been too gloomy a way to start the day. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk with a lot to unpack. And I've got a number of questions, but I'm going to hold off because I think we've got a few in the crowd and also on Mentimeter. So we'll start off with some here and then we'll shift online. Well, there's a whole bunch here. Where to start? Let's go around this way. Start with Beth.
Thank you, Michael. That was really comprehensive and very clear. I'd just like to raise two risks and see if you have responses for them that I expected to see and didn't see. So maybe that's useful to discuss more further. So the first risk, and it relates to, in part, to what you were saying about the assumption that data is neutral. Data is also considered generally to be ethereal and non-physical, but actually it has a very physical location. It has an environmental risk, and I kind of expected to see some sort of theological response to that as well. And the second risk is religious actors themselves engaging in the collection of big data and the utilization of big data. And I mean, in a particular use case, I would think of prayer apps in particular. So I just wondered if you had any specific responses to those two risks.
Thank you. Let me do the second one first. Thanks very much. Yes, there have been instances where, again, particularly in the US, where all this is rather more developed than in the UK, where churches that one might perhaps most kindly refer to as entrepreneurial have latched onto this big data analysis as a really good way of initiating mission strategy. Yeah? So they get all the local information, much local information about the people in their areas they possibly can, and then they can target them with, there's a couple here who might want to get married, so we can hone in on them, this kind of thing. So yeah, you're absolutely right. This is an area where churches have used precisely these kinds of commercially driven ways of using data to further their own interests. And I personally have a considerable amount of skepticism towards that, because I think that the kinds of risks I've been talking about around entrenching preconceptions and unfairnesses and biases are equally applicable in that kind of context. The first one, you're talking about localization of data.
But the data doesn't come without a cost in environmental terms. Like there are server farms.
Oh, yes.
So that's a risk as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, that's quite right. Yes. Simply in terms of the carbon footprint of all this. Absolutely right. I mean, Edinburgh has this massive supercomputer that's been much talk, well, perhaps not enough talk about latterly, which is going to have an enormous carbon footprint, and you're quite right. That's another dimension to all of this. Yeah, thank you.
I'll take one from this side.
This has been quite a fascinating talk, but it's very much Western approach. I just wondered if you want to comment further about China and applications in the third world to this data.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Yes, I have been. I should perhaps have had that as a disclaimer at an early point. This is a very Western-focused presentation. Two very different kind of sets of issues emerge in the two kinds of contexts you're talking about. If you're talking about a society like China, where there are considerable restrictions on the freedom of individual citizens, then of course the potential of for data surveillance, for example, that I talked about, to encroach further on the privacies and freedoms of those citizens is enormous. And there are doubtless various, and of course there's also the way in which bots and troll farms and so on operating from such regimes can have major influences on the outcomes in the West, certainly around recent democratic processes such as general elections in the UK, presidential elections in the US. There's been a lot of talk about the kind of influence that this kind of these kind of operations might have had. I think there's an increasing awareness of the existence of such operations, though that won't necessarily, limit their effect in the short term, at least. So yeah, there are a raft of issues around that. In the two-thirds world context, the thing becomes very, very ambiguous because, of course, access to the kind of technologies facilitated by mobile phones, for example, can be extremely important. So that not having such access can be very, very limiting in terms of life chances and so on. So I've talked about the way in which in the West we need to perhaps weigh up risk issues around what we do and don't disclose around our digital footprint. We're privileged in a way to be in a position to weigh up such risks because for those in other contexts, it may be a no-brainer that they have to take on such risks. That's just a very cursory and ill-informed comment on your question, but thanks for that. And yes, I should have said at the outset, this is a very Western perspective, and it would be fascinating to draw on other perspectives and look at the particular issues that all this raises in those. Thank you.
Hi, Mike. I'm going to try and combine two questions from online, mainly because I feel like they're both touching on the same thing. I think echoing some of the comments that Beth brought up yesterday as well. So I think it's kind of the first is you talk of big data being used for the promotion of human flourishing, but on what scale or time frame are we counting this? Future thousands or current hundreds of people? So when we're talking about big data being used for flourishing, when's the flourishing? And then the second one is that kind of taps onto that is, does the role of the church or other religious institutions not risk the use of religious institutions trying to further fundamental or extreme ends in the way that Beth mentioned about the AI code with the Southern Baptists?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, and Beth raised again the issue just now of how churches might be complicit in some of the less savoury aspects of the use of big data. Sorry, the first one, what time scale are we talking about?
Yes, so are we dealing with, you talk about promoting big data, promoting human flourishing. Are we talking about this in terms of future, we can use it, I suppose, almost for nefarious ends now? I'm interpreting this question now, so sorry to the poser. If we use it for nefarious ends now, but it will save, thousands in the future, is that better than using it appropriately for 10 million?
Well, I mean, if one did a sort of analogy here, would it be thought ethical or legitimate to, torture 10 people now, in the hope that doing so, through drug administration or something, in the hope of, providing something that might then go on to save thousands in the future? I'm not sure that's a helpful kind of way of thinking about it. I mean, unquestionably, if one thinks about human flourishing, there are benefits that accrue from the kinds of things we can now do using the internet. What I would argue for is the fairer and more equitable distribution of such benefits and the regulation and limitation of the downsides of those benefits. So, like anybody else, I book train fares. The train that I came up to this conference from, I booked it online. It's really handy being able to do that, So there are great benefits. They do enable flourishing, in albeit in that case in a rather trivial kind of way. I didn't have to trek down to the rail station and buy a ticket there. What I suppose I want to do is say, well, when I did that, there was various things that I surrendered, including information about my movements over these few days. I don't know if the alleged existence of a website called burglmenow.com, I don't know if that really exists or not. But if it does, the fact that I'm here and not at home, maybe. So what I'm saying is one wants to perhaps facilitate the kinds of transactions that can be of great benefit to people, whilst limit and regulate those kinds of activities that are done, as it were, behind people's backs. Yeah?
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. I'm just sort of continuing on this theme. I did want to give you more of a chance to speak about these benefits and what they would look like. So especially when you were talking about churches not just involving themselves in restrictions, but also taking hold of benefits. I hear that you're talking about distributing benefits and things like that, but could you maybe unpack more specifically what kind of activities would that look like?
What a good question. Yes, I was in part deliberately being rather vague on all of that, because of course, It's going to vary from context to context what those benefits might be. But it might be in the same way that I mentioned in response to Beth's question, that there is at least one church that, and doubtless more, that uses data analysis to further its missionary endeavours. It might be that churches might use information about their local context to generate better ways of assisting people in need, for example. I was talking really about the way in which churches are gatherings of people, and they're gatherings of people which can be a relatively free space for discussion. Now, I suppose in a way that itself reflects a rather academic kind of perspective, that what people want to do is discuss things. But there may very well be more practical ways in which they can help as well, and obviously sensitivity to local context is going to be key to that. What do you think? What else could churches do you think?
Wait for our talk.
Sorry?
We wait for our talk.
Yeah, yes, I mean, I just sketched out something very, very preliminary there. But I do think that churches can be a great force for social good, and that there are ways in which the use of big data can be, or could be, potentially be a force for the common good.
Got two quick questions.
Sure.
Yeah. Where I'm coming from India, and there's this talk about time and time again in the press, it comes that the administration oversees many lapses of data leaks. For example, we have a nationalized security number, and there's this push by the government to link everything from the bank account, your driving license, everything to that one number, in the name of giving better facilities. But it's been proven, and time again, there are reports that these are being leaked to individual agencies and furthering certain ideologies, and it's quite scary in that sense. I was just wondering, as a minority Christian community, where I'm coming from, do you have any suggestions or any reflections on how we as a church could be involved in this? Primarily because, coming to the second question, it's about the fact that most communities don't think this is something that Christianity should be engaging in, or why are you talking about big data sort of thing? Why don't you just talk about the Bible and faith? That kind of a question is also there. So in that sense, how do we further the conversation? Do you have any suggestions for a minority Christian community? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Again, I'll answer the second question first. It's a constant refrain, isn't it, that churches should stick to preaching, and the Bible and so on. My personal belief is that the churches should be doing far more than that, and should be engaging with social injustice and attempting to right such injustices. And what I see in the kinds of aspects of big data I've talked about today is the potential for enormous social injustice, and I therefore think it's highly appropriate that churches should be engaging with this, making people aware of what the issues are, and where possible lobbying for ways of addressing these kinds of issues. I mean, even as I say this, I think my heart slightly sinks, because I'm saying, we need international legislation to address some of these kinds of issues. How on earth are you going to get that? I mean, it might be considered a pipe dream, but humanity needs people who dream, in all kinds of different contexts. As regards the particular thing in which you're talking about, the linking of data in that Indian context, this is really heinous, isn't it? Because on the one hand, I was talking about the impossibility of anonymization when data sets are linked, and linking data sets through everything going through a single national insurance number is a great way to ensure that once one thing's hacked, a whole lot of other things can be accessed as well. So that's one issue. Simply in terms of cyber security, it seems to me to be bad practice to link everything in that kind of way. Then there's the second issue about possible corruption in terms of access to such things being actually facilitated in some governmental context. What can one say? I mean, it's horrendous. And it does seem to me that the kind of situation you're describing there is very bad news for individual citizens. In the same way that I could have been a great deal more explicit, I think, about the fact that English citizens' NHS data is being widely shared by private concerns, unless you tell them not to do it. Yeah. Hi. Thank you.
One thing I worry about almost as much as the social injustice problems that you've mentioned, big data, is the narrative of a kind of reaction, a defense that leads to a rampant individualism.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me think, what do we actually mean when we talk about ownership? The hegemony of ownership. We've been shedding data for millennia in terms of footprints, photographs. Some religious cultures object to having a photograph taken. So it's easy to forget the kind of slippery slope in any technology, and where do we draw the line? And are we just asking for some of the kind of very libertarian extreme stances of retreat into my own individualistic shell as a result? And could that do even more harm?
Yeah, again, what a good question. Very good point. I like your point about surrendering data for millennia. Absolutely, that's how detective stories work, isn't it? Yeah. I've just been reading Dorothy L. Sayers, which is exactly like that, isn't it? People surrender data which then get picked up, and then their activities can then be pieced together. I suppose I go back to what I said at the outset, that what we're facing, and this has been widely commented on, what we're facing with the advent of big data is not just more, it goes beyond more. It's a qualitative as well as a quantitative difference that starts to emerge when there's just so much out there. I think that does then raise new questions, not least around the way in which data can be linked, as I was saying. Sorry, do you want to come back on me? I'm not sure I've fully responded to what you were saying there.
I'm just concerned that the solution becomes, I'm concerned the solution for many people becomes to retreat into your own individual self and claim that ownership is the biggest criterion. And actually, our whole lives are intertwined, always have been, with other people. There's so much of us in the public domain and always has been. So how can we say we own some of these things?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Because, of course, one of the great things that's often touted around social media, for example, is the way it increases your interconnectedness with others, which might be thought to be a very good thing. And certainly, that alternative of just withdrawing completely from that and adopting a very individualistic stance isn't something I'd wish to condone at all. I suppose, as with all things, it's a case of finding some kind of happy medium, as it were. Yeah, I'm not sure what else to say really about around that. There are, I'm sure, still people who really don't use the internet very much, if at all, and can live very happy social lives in a traditional, actually meeting people kind of way. And I suppose it's just a question of each person then working out for themselves what feels most comfortable in terms of, if I might put it as traditional personal interactions, socializing through whatever means they have of actually face-to-face contact with people, and the kind of social presence that you have through online activity. And I'm suggesting there are rather more risks of various kinds, many of them hidden, to the second kind of activity, which perhaps the first kind avoids. Thank you.
Right, so gone slightly over time, but that's no worries at all. We'll leave it there. If you'd like to join me in giving Michael a round of applause for what a great session, really, really great session.
Thanks very much.
So we have a little bit of a break now, teas and coffees in the lunch hall. And then at 10:50, we're back for the New Voices talks, which are going to be short talks, which are going to take place here and in the Rendell, is it Rendell House?
Rendell Harris, basically
Rendell,
the room opposite.
Yeah, it's on that side. And we'd really encourage you guys to attend those talks as well, because we've got some great papers. So with that being said, you're free to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you.